It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm going to be walking you through the first part of our show today. As always, we're going to start with our recap. We're going to go into a little bit of the weather concerns that we have for today, move on and talk a little bit about the Vegas lines. Then we're going to get into some pitching choices. I'm going to bring on my co-host and pitching guru, Josh Kalachi. He's going to give you some ideas on what he likes today. Today's a very tough day for pitching, which we'll get into in a little bit. But there's really no standout choices for you, and there's really not a lot of guys that look like they're going to get blown up. So it's very even across the board, and, you know, as it is on most nights, pitching is probably going to decide a lot of these big tournaments, and it's definitely going to be the difference between you winning or losing in your cash games today. After we talk about our pitchers, we're going to go on and discuss some of the hitters that we think are in good spots today. You know, guys you should be targeting, trying to get into your lineups. And then Josh and I will give you our cornerstones, the guys that we're going to be putting in our lineups and building around to, you know, try to make some more money tonight. But before we get into tonight, let's look over yesterday a little bit and try to see what happened yesterday, try to see what things we can see that can help us with our lineup construction today. There were a couple good pitching performances yesterday. Ubaldo Jimenez had 28 points. He was one of the top scorers on the day. Not something that everybody saw, but if you go and look back at his game logs, one thing you will notice is that he is very good when he's at home in Baltimore. So he already put up a 30 and another number in the high 20s in Baltimore. So nothing about this 28 point performance that he had yesterday was really all that much out of line with what he has been doing in his home starts. So basically that's something that, you know I missed yesterday. There were a couple people that were on him, including the guy who won the moonshot yesterday, had Ubaldo on top of his roster. So that was a good, that was a good pick for him, and it wound up working out pretty well. A couple high-scoring rosters that did have him. Another one is Shelby Miller. Shelby Miller had a 27-point performance again yesterday. I mean, this guy, Josh talked about him last time, about how he's using some different pitches, and apparently using them pretty well. He put up another 27-point performance. He was another one of those guys that you could have had. He was a little bit cheaper than the top options, probably somewhere around like 6th to 8th most expensive on DraftKings. I think he might have been even lower than that. No, actually, he was a little bit higher than that on FanDuel. But again, if he's putting up 27 points on DraftKings, that's a good game for him. And the last guy is Max Scherzer. Max Scherzer also had another 27-point performance. So, I mean, he's been about as good as he can be since coming over from the American League. When I saw that he was getting a start and Strasburg got pushed, he was definitely a guy who I had in a couple of my rosters last night. And the other pitcher, the one that was the big surprise for me, and the guy who was probably the best value on the day, was Colby Lewis. Colby Lewis for Texas. Those Texas pitchers, I don't know what it is. I mean, Wandy Rodriguez threw a gem the other day. Colby Lewis had 24 DraftKings points yesterday. I mean, again, one of the best pitching values coming out of there. It makes me wonder what Nick Martinez is going to do tonight. I don't know what's in the water down there in Texas, but all three of these guys were gas cans last year. These were three guys that we targeted against on a regular basis in daily fantasy. Anytime one of those three was on the mound, they were guys that we wanted to take bats against. But so far this year, that's been burning money if you've been doing it. So I don't know what it is. I mean, Texas is actually a hitter's ballpark. You would think that some of these guys are going to get lit up at some point, but I mean, you know, Wandy just had a good start. Colby's just had a good start. I think Nick Martinez is like 3-0 or 4-1 or something like that. So I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's their pitching coach, but the way they've been going, he definitely deserves a raise. As for the bats last night, you know, the Pittsburgh stack was the big one early on. They only scored 4 runs, but they managed to score a ton of fantasy points. A lot of those guys had extra base hits. You know, Polanco had a couple stolen bases. Marte had the big 3-run home run. McCutchen had a couple hits that he strung together. Ho Kang or whatever his name is, he had a couple that he had a couple hits he strung together. Neil Walker had another good game for him. So that was the stack that started out, and then all of a sudden the Yankees went crazy and started hitting home runs. They wound up scoring 11 runs. I think they had 5 home runs. A-Rod had one. Beltran had one. Gardner had one. I think McCann might have had one. So they were leading the clubhouse going into the late games. And then the Nationals came out and pounded out about another 11 runs in the first 2 innings of their game. So there were a lot of National stacks and a lot of people with, guys like Denard Span. Who else was a big one for them? They had, Escobar had a big game for them. Zimmerman had a home run. He had a big game for him. So if you had guys like Zimmerman, Gardner, Span, A-Rod, Teixeira, Escobar, those were a lot of the guys that we saw on some of the top scoring rosters yesterday. They all put up about 20 points. A lot of them had home runs. Escobar, I think, had 5 hits. That's how he got his 20-something points. So those were a lot of the guys that you wanted on your roster yesterday. A couple of the other guys that weren't in those high-scoring games, Logan Forsythe, who was somebody that Rath had mentioned during his late DFS minute before lineups locked. He had a huge game, hit a home run, finished with about 26 DraftKings points. I think he was over 10 FanDuel points, and he was very cheap, $2,800 on DraftKings. I think he was either min-priced or about $2,400 or something on FanDuel. So he was definitely somebody that was worthy of inclusion in your rosters, and you were definitely happy tonight if you had him. Carlos Gomez is back for the game yesterday. As he's going to do at times, he's one of those guys that can score in many ways. Can hit home runs for you, steal bases, get some hits. So he was another guy who put up over 20. And Chris Davis with a C from Baltimore, he hit a home run in a good matchup yesterday. It was a little pricey, but he was somebody who I was talking up in chat and saying, he's a guy that's got home run upside today. And, he came through for me as well. So he was another guy with another 20-plus point game. And, those were basically the guys that you wanted on your roster. Again, stacking and pairing was the way to go, as we had spoken about in our recent articles. There were a lot of people with Washington bats, a lot of people with Yankees bats who wound up getting up on top of those leaderboards today. So if you're playing in the GPPs, that's definitely something you want to do. For the cash games, though, there were a lot of guys that we mentioned, guys like Forsythe who were good, good values, allowed you to get into guys like Anthony Rizzo, who hit a home run, who we mentioned yesterday, and a bunch of the guys that were in our picks who also went out and, did pretty well. If you can find a couple of those cheap bats when lineups lock, come out later on in the day, it allows you to fit in a lot of the studs that we talk about earlier in the day on the show before we actually see those lineups. So remember, make sure you check back around 6:30. Rath usually comes out and does his video, and that'll give you some of the value plays that we see popping up, guys that we didn't think about earlier in the day, but when we see where they're hitting and what spot they are in the lineup, those guys become the glue that helps you get those big studs into your lineup and still get those high scores that we're looking for. So that basically wraps it up for our recap of last night. We're going to go on and talk a little bit about the weather before we get going with today's games. There's really no rain as of now to worry about. There aren't any games that look like they're going to be in jeopardy tonight, but weather is going to be a big factor because there's a lot of games with a lot of wind going on. The Cardinals-Cleveland game, 19-mile-per-hour wind blowing left to right. There were tornado warnings in Ohio yesterday, night games in Cleveland, so you can tell that it's going to be windy out there. There's going to be some weather concerns. Again, blowing left to right isn't really what we're looking for. What we really want is when the wind's blowing straight out. There's wind blowing right to left in Baltimore for the Baltimore and Toronto game. 17-mile-an-hour winds in Detroit for that Detroit-Minnesota game, blowing left to right as well. But there are 3 games where the wind is blowing straight out. So those are some of the ones that I wanted to mention with you right now. The Detroit game, it's kind of blowing out, but it's a little bit more of a left to right wind. So you could see some extra home runs in that game. Is definitely somebody who can get lit up. He's had those days where he's just imploded on himself, so that would be something that you might want to keep in mind if you're looking at any Detroit bats today. But the other 3 games, the wind is blowing straight out 15 miles per hour in Philly today for that Philly and Pittsburgh Pirate game. Now, the thing about this game is you got A.J. Burnett, who has been known to give up home runs from time to time, going up against Sean O'Sullivan, who's kind of like the emergency starter for the Phillies today. So that's a game with the wind blowing 15 miles per hour straight out in a home run hitting ballpark where we could see some fireworks. That could be one of those, 8-7, 10-6 kind of games by the end of it, where you get a lot of fantasy goodness, a lot of runs, a couple home runs out of it. So that's definitely one that we're going to be looking at later on, see if there's any bats that we like. The Atlanta-Cincy game, that's another hitter's ballpark there in Cincinnati, the Great American Ballpark. 15-mile-per-hour winds blowing straight out there as well. So that's another park that gives up a lot of home runs. There's a couple good matchups for some of the home run hitters today, namely the first baseman, who we'll get into later on. So that's another place that we want to be looking. There's going to be, should be some balls flying out of there. And then the last game on the list is Oakland and Boston. 16-mile-per-hour wind blowing straight out in Oakland. Now, that's more of a pitcher's park, so it's not an easy place to hit home runs anyway. But with 16-mile-per-hour wind aiding you, it basically helps the hitters and it hurts the pitchers because that wind is coming right in the pitcher's face. So a guy who throws, 95, 96 might lose a mile per hour or two off his fastball when he's throwing it against the wind. And obviously the hitters, if they can get the ball up in the air, that wind isn't going to push a pop fly to second base to be a home run. But if you get one that's kind of back by the warning track, it's going to give it that little extra boost to get it over the wall for you. And in a big park like Oakland, that could be something that comes into play. So those are the games where the weather's going to be an issue. Again, like I said, it doesn't mean that we're going to just target guys in those games, but it is something to keep in mind if you're choosing between two players, trying to figure out who's got the better home run potential. Home runs are more important on FanDuel where, that's really the way to get big scores. These are some of the guys, if you're deciding between two guys, these are some of the things that could push you over the edge. So that wraps it up for our weather concerns. We're going to move on and talk about the Vegas lines. There's not a lot that we see today. There's only 2 games that have 7-run totals. The first one is the Miami Marlins at the LA Dodgers. It's a matchup between Matt Bolsinger and Dan Haren. Haren's actually been pretty good so far this year, and Bolsinger is a rookie. He made his first start a couple games back, did pretty decent, wound up with about 16 or 17 DraftKings points on the day. Nothing spectacular, but he didn't get lit up. He's not somebody who I think is a gas can, especially not in Dodger Stadium. Dodger Stadium doesn't yield a lot of hits, doesn't yield a lot of runs. It's usually a place, as we said, where we'll see low totals from time to time, even with the that Dodgers team having so much offensive firepower. So that's basically one of the games that they have at 7. I could see it staying low scoring. Probably not something that most people were going to figure on. I think there are some people who are going to be targeting against Bolsinger, but I don't know if that's the best idea. Vegas doesn't really think he's going to get lit up today, so I'm not going to go against what they're thinking. The other game is a little bit surprising to me. That's only a 7-run total, and that's the Yankees at Tampa Bay. Again, Tampa Bay is not a great hitter's park either. We do see some low totals coming out there, and it's a pitching matchup between Chris Archer, who basically was on fire to start the year and then had 2 bad starts in a row. Going to be interesting to see if Josh has any thoughts on him when he comes to do his pitcher's report, because he's a guy that I'm kind of on the fence on. Looking at some of his numbers, you would think that he might be a good start today, and then looking at some of the other numbers in his recent starts, it's just kind of head-scratching to me. So I'm going to be looking for some more information on him before I make my ultimate decision. And he's going up against Nathan Eovaldi. I'm not really a huge fan of Eovaldi, even though I'm a Yankees fan. I mean, he just hasn't shown me all that much. He's not a high strikeout guy like I thought he was. People told me that he throws hard, which he does throw hard, but he throws very straight, so he throws a very hittable ball. So I'm a little bit on the fence still. He hasn't been horrible to start the season here, but again, it's a 7-run total in that game. You would think that these are guys that are, some of the stud pitchers on the day, and to be perfectly honest, of the 4 of them that we just mentioned, I don't think there's anybody that I'm really on, other than maybe looking at Archer if I could figure out if he's, gonna get back to his early season form. There are 3 games today that have 8.5 run totals on them. That's Baltimore, who's favored over Toronto, so they're figuring that those Orioles bats are going to get to the left-hander Mark Burley. That game's being played in Baltimore as well, so not a bad hitter's park at all. You got some good right-handed power bats on that team. Guys like Adam Jones. I mean, Paredes is actually better from the other side. Chris Davis is better from the other side. But you'll probably have guys like Delman Young batting up towards the top of that order as well. A couple guys who are proven mashers of left-handed pitching. So Adam Jones, who we'll talk about later, is probably the big one. But, again, they're expecting a lot of runs in that game, so definitely something to look at. Baltimore's favored, so you want to look at those Baltimore bats. Detroit is another team that we talked about earlier. With the wind blowing out there, it only makes me like some of those bats a little more. They get to go up against Kyle Gibson. Gibson's actually been pretty good so far this year, but if you played any DFS last year at all, he was a guy that we like to target against. He is a little bit of a gas can, has gotten blown up a few times before. And then the last game is the Washington-Arizona game. That's Ruby De La Rosa going up for Arizona at home against the Washington Bats. Those Washington Bats have been absolutely on fire. We'll talk about some of them later. De La Rosa usually struggles with some of those left-handed bats. So guys like Span and Harper, who have been, absolutely on fire. Like I said, Rath had mentioned a couple weeks ago that Denard Span was one of the top, I think it was the top 30 outfielders on DraftKings last year. So his price has come up, so he's starting to reflect that. But again, I mean, he's a guy that tends to go overlooked because he's not a big power guy. but he just keeps getting hits, steals a couple bases, scores a couple runs. And when you look at it at the end of the night, you know, he was 2 for 4 with 3 runs scored, a walk, and you know, a stolen base, and winds up with 22, 24 DraftKings points for you. So he's definitely a guy that should be on your radar. Again, speed plays better on DraftKings, so we like him more on DraftKings than we do over on FanDuel. FanDuel, we want the home run hitters. So, you know, Bryce Harper, the way he's been hitting, we'll talk about him later. He's definitely, you know, more of a FanDuel play. Whereas Span, if you're going to use him, I think you want to try to use him more on DraftKings. So that pretty much wraps it up for the high total games. I'm going to talk about some of the big pitching favorites real fast before we get into the pitchers. C.J. Wilson is the biggest favorite on the board today. He's minus 200 going up against the Colorado Rockies. I think that has more to do with the fact that he's opposite of Kyle Kendricks, who's somebody that, you know, basically has been getting lit up, been giving up 300 batting average to both sides of the plate. Somebody who I think they're expecting the, you know, the Angels bats to get to for a couple runs today. So Wilson, the biggest favorite on the board at minus 200, followed by A.J. Burnett, minus 165 against O'Sullivan of Philly. We mentioned O'Sullivan's a rookie, a little bit of a gas can, probably a guy who's going to get blown up. Wind is blowing out there today, which kind of dampens my enthusiasm for A.J. Burnett, but I'm going to make a case for him in a minute on, you know, why he is still one of my favorite starters on the day. Alan McHugh is at minus 155. He bounced back pretty well in his last start, so he's another guy that we want to, you know, take a look at. He could be good today. Bolzinger, as we mentioned, from the Dodgers is minus 150. So he's a minus 150 favorite in a game with a total of only 7. And he is kind of cheap overall. So as much as I haven't looked at him yet, he might be somebody that you want to include in some of those GPP rosters. I definitely don't think a rookie making a second start is safe enough for your cash games, but, you know, Bolzinger might have some sneaky upside today. And then we have a couple guys that are over 135. Anthony DeScalfani, who started off the season hot and has struggled a little bit lately. Steven Strasburg, who's coming off an injury. I have no idea how he's going to pitch. Alfredo Simon, he's in that Detroit game. He's, you know, expected to get a lot of run support. Minnesota has given up some big games. We'll talk about him in a minute as well. And then James Paxton from Seattle is the last one. So those are the guys who are basically, you know, in the best spots today, who Vegas is given the best chance to win. Of all those guys I mentioned, the one guy who I'm probably on the most is A.J. Burnett today. And basically, there's a couple reasons for it. So let me lay out the case for you. Burnett goes up against the Phillies. Phillies have the second worst batting average in the league right now against right-handed pitching at 216. They're last in the league in runs scored versus right-handed pitching with only 72. And they have a 21.8% strikeout rate, which is not incredibly high, but it's also not low. It's not like they're a team, you know, they basically last week they were a team that wasn't striking out at all. Now they're striking out a little. They're probably around mid-pack with that percentage. Not the team that's going to give you the most Ks that you want to target against. But again, with the low runs and the low hits that they have, you know, it's definitely a pretty good spot for a pitcher to be in. Burnett so far this season's been great. He's got a 1.66 ERA, a 1.18 WHIP, 31 strikeouts, and 38 innings pitched. So, you know, basically he's been really, really solid. He's getting you around 20 DraftKings points almost every time he steps out to the mound. He's got a couple wins. The bats behind him have been pretty hot, so, you know, Pittsburgh is expected to score a lot of runs today against a guy like O'Sullivan. So there is a lot of upside to using a guy like Burnett today. Now, again, when I first started doing my write-ups and I put him down there, you know, I didn't know that there was going to be 15-mile-per-hour winds blowing out in a home run hitting ballpark like Citizens Bank. So that does dampen my enthusiasm for him a little. But again, I still think he's in a good spot. I don't think he's overpriced. On FanDuel, he's a little bit more pricey than he is on DraftKings. On DraftKings, I think he's in a really good spot. FanDuel, I'd have to double check and think about it. I don't know if he's going to be able to get me the 18, 19 points I need over there. But I definitely think on DraftKings he's a pretty good bet to get you around 20, 25 points, which would be excellent value at his price of $8,200. So A.J. Burnett is one of the guys that I'm definitely looking at pitcher today. Another guy that I'm looking at, I'm going to give you guys, I actually think because of his price that he's even cash game safe, but he's definitely a GPP play as well, and that's Alfredo Simon. Again, the wind is blowing out a little bit there, which kind of dampens my enthusiasm a little, but Minnesota has been giving up some really big games to some starting pitchers lately, especially right-handed starting pitchers. They have 168 strikeouts and 654 at-bats, which is a 25.7% K rate. Now, that's one of the highest in the league against any handedness of pitcher. So, basically, if you have a guy, you know, Simon isn't really a huge strikeout guy, but he pitches deep into games, and he has been known to get a couple strikeouts. So, you know, his stuff isn't that bad. And if you have a high strikeout team, which is going to raise the strikeout amount that he might be able to get today, that can give him a really, really nice floor underneath himself. He's a 135 favorite, and basically his last 2 games he had tough matchups against the Chicago White Sox and the Kansas City Royals. But in the 4 games before that, he had 20 DraftKings points in every one of those games, which, again, doesn't sound like a ton of points, but his price today is only $5,000 on DraftKings. So if he can get you at least 15 points, he's going to return good value for you and, obviously give you a ton of money to spend up on whatever bats you want. And there are some big bats that we're going to get into later that I would really want in my lineup. And by using a guy like Simon, I've been able to fit them all in. And I don't feel like I'm giving up too much, even though, you're coming down to a cheaper guy. Basically there's some warts on all the big pitchers today. Sale's a guy who I'm sure Josh is going to talk about in a little bit. His best pitch has always been the slider, and he's trying not to throw it so much to save his arm. So he's using more of a changeup, but he hasn't really been able to find the plate with that changeup, and it's not really something that is scaring opposing hitters. So he's been getting knocked around a lot more than he usually does, basically because he's coming off of that slider, which used to be his money pitch. Guy like Strasburg had to get scratched 2 days ago. He hasn't looked good yet all season. He hasn't returned anywhere near value in any of his starts yet. Both of those guys have price breaks. They're both under $10,000 for, I think, the first time all season today. But even at the prices that they're sitting at right now, neither one of them really gives me a ton of confidence in them. But, again, I'm not the pitching guru. That's Josh's turn. So I am going to kick it over to Josh. Pitching is going to be tough today. Like I said, we got guys like Sale, guys like Strasburg, up top. I find myself looking more like guys like Volquez, guys like McHugh. So I'm going to kick it over to Josh and let him kind of give you the rundown on it all and maybe make a little bit more sense out of this whole pitching stuff for me. So, Josh, you want to take it away for everybody?
Yeah, the first thing you talked about was you were asking about Archer earlier, and it brought up a little bit of a good point in the chat that we have at the bottom of your page right now on RotoCurve. And what we were talking about is Archer has been great so far this season, but until those last 2 starts. He allowed, I believe, 5 earned runs 2 starts ago, and I think he allowed 4 or 5 to the Texas Rangers in his last start, which isn't something you're targeting for 2 guys or for a guy that has potential to put up a big strikeout number. I don't like him today because he's facing the Yankees, who have just been on fire. That offense has been incredible, and they're likely to have a lot of left-handed bats. And with the fact that Archer struggled in the last 2 days or last 2 starts, I just can't go with him, especially at that high price. But there are a few guys that I do like today. Obviously, today is one of those days where pitching is just all over the place. You have guys that C.J. Wilson was a high favorite, which probably won't happen. Many other slates. You have guys that like Kyle Kendrick, who you'll be targeting for your bats. But in between, there aren't many huge options. They're just guys that we want to put in our lineups every day. Obviously, we talk about guys like when Garrett Cole's pitching, Clayton Kershaw pitching, guys like Felix Hernandez. You're going to be in your lineups. But with all the different pitching options today, it's going to be nice to see because in these 50-50s head-to-heads and tournaments, there can be a lot of different combinations on DraftKings and a lot of different pitchers being used on FanDuel. So we'll start with the pitchers that I do like today, starting with Edinson Volquez against the Rangers. He is a 50-50 head-to-head lineup guy for me, and I also like using him in tournaments as well. Volquez had a blister his last start, and for those of you who have played baseball that have pitched, you understand that when a pitcher has a blister, it really changes the game for them because it limits their ability to get the grip on the ball and their off-speed stuff. And Volquez is a guy that throws a 2-seam fastball, which for those of you guys that don't know, if you look at a baseball, they have a raised seams, which for a pitcher throwing a 2-seam fastball, that can rip your hands apart, and that's why it was hard for Volquez to throw that 2-seamer, and it led to him walking 4 guys in 1 inning. But I do like him today because that blister seems to have healed very well, and he's facing the Rangers, who Volquez also previously pitched for, but the Rangers are struggling big time against righties so far this season. They're hitting just 212, and I think they're slugging just over 300, which is a very, very low rate. And it's something that we like to target because guys that have a low slugging percentage against aren't giving up a lot of extra base hits, which can lead to runs, which is negative points for us in daily fantasy baseball. But another reason why I like Volquez is because he has a lot of movement on his pitches. We just indicated with that 2-seamer. And that gives him the ability to throw a lot of ground balls and strike a lot of hitters out. Because when a guy that uses 2 pitches like Volquez, he throws a lot of his fastball, his curveball most of the time, that gives him the ability to move the ball into lefties with his 2-seamer, away from righties with his curveball, and or vice versa, into righties with his 2-seamer, away from lefties with his two-seamer as well. But what that can do is he mixes in that curveball, and he does have a changeup. It gives him the ability to use 3 pitches in different ways against a variety of different hitters. Now, you've heard me talk about changeups before from right-handed pitchers and how that's very efficient against left-handed batters. And that's something that Volquez does use a lot, and it'll be a big thing against that Texas lineup with lefties like Shin-Soo Choo, Prince Fielder, and even Carlos Peguero, who's hit the ball very well so far this year. That brings us to our next pitcher, and I believe Benny likes this guy as well today. That's Alfredo Simon against the Twins. The Twins have struck out the 4th most times in baseball against right-handed pitching. Now, Simon is not a big strikeout guy, but when facing an offense that does strike out a lot, it's a little bit of a boost for him. Obviously, Benny talked about the high runs expected for the Tigers, so Simon is in a good line for a win based on the Vegas projections, and that's another reason why I like to target him in my 50-50s and head-to-heads. Now, he's not a tournament play for me because he doesn't have great upside. Now, what has given him the benefit of the doubt so far this year? He's always been a fastball pitcher. He's had some just make guys get out on their own as he throws a fastball inside, outside, just makes guys swing the bat and he pitches to contact. But something interesting about Simon, and that's the reason why I'm targeting today, he uses his split finger fastball more now than ever. For those of you that aren't familiar with a split finger fastball, it's exactly what it sounds like. Their pitchers place the ball directly in between their index finger and their middle finger, and they throw it just like that. And what it does is it doesn't have much spin, but it causes the ball to be a little bit slower, like a changeup, and it drops a lot. Now, when a ball drops in the zone and he's able to throw for a strike, which Simon's been able to do, it causes a lot of ground balls, and that's something that we definitely target for pitchers because it leads to more outs. And outs is a good thing because it gets a guy deeper into the game, allows him to be in line for the win, and registers fantasy points. Another guy I like, speaking of ground balls, is A.J. Burnett. This guy's ground ball rate has been insane this year, 59%, which is, I believe, his career high. Now, it's hard to sustain a ground ball rate that high, but it just tells you how well he has been pitching. Burnett is a huge favorite today. Benny talked about him earlier, facing the Phillies, who is his former team. But the Phillies are hitting, like Benny said, just .216. They're slugging just over .300 against right-handed pitching. But they don't strike out a lot, and we've talked about this before. I mentioned it last week when we were talking about Shelby Miller. But what Shelby Miller was able to do is use his two-seamer to a huge advantage to be able to strike out those left-handed hitters. And if you guys have seen A.J. Burnett pitch, he also has a very good two-seamer. He runs that in on left-handed pitchers, and it just runs right back over the plate. You get some backwards Ks or strikeouts looking, which is a huge thing because when you're talking about strikeouts, you target guys that can miss bats. And a guy like Burnett hasn't missed a lot of bats this year, although his strikeout rate has been reasonably high. It's because against these left-handed batters, he's throwing this two-seam fastball that runs back over the plate for a strike 3 call, which is a very big benefit because if a guy doesn't swing, there's no chance he's going to be able to get a hit, and that's one of the reasons why Burnett has been so successful. We mentioned his ground ball rate, and that's one of the things that I want to talk about now is because Burnett is a two-pitch guy right now. He used to throw in the mid-90s when he pitched back in his days with the Yankees and even before so. With that fastball, losing its velocity now, he's only been the low 90s. He can hit 91 every now and then, 92. But he throws his curveball, and he throws it a lot for strikes. Now, a guy that can throw a curveball for a strike is huge in daily fantasy baseball because that means he can throw 2 pitches at any point in the count. For those of you that watched guys like Bronson Arroyo in the past, guys like Bartolo Colon before he started throwing all fastballs, these guys have thrown any pitch in any count, which means the hitters don't know exactly what's coming. And that's a big thing in Major League Baseball because anybody can catch up to a fastball. But with Burnett throwing his curveball for a strike, it enables him to get more ground balls, more strikeouts, and get ahead in the count with an off-speed pitch, meaning he can use that two-seam fastball later in the count for a strikeout looking, which is exactly what we're looking for, definitely getting those strikeouts and those fantasy points. There's one other pitcher I want to mention here. It's a guy that I'm targeting, and he's a guy that Benny and I talked about a lot before the show. It's rookie Noah Syndergaard. And I'm telling you guys, if you haven't seen him pitch yet in the minor leagues or on YouTube or anything like that, you have to watch this Mets game tonight. This guy is a stud. He's one of these guys, just another Mets right-handed prospect. You see guys like Matt Harvey coming up and just absolutely dominating the National League. Zach Wheeler looked great before his injury. Now it's Noah Syndergaard's turn. It's his first time pitching. He's going to face the Cubs today. Right now, he's not a 50-50 or head-to-head guy for me today, simply because sometimes they bring these big prospects up and they don't throw more 5 or 6 innings. And I think that limits his ability to get to 20 or 30 fantasy points, which we would need for most of your 50-50s and head-to-heads. That being said, Syndergaard is very cheap given his talent and his ability to pitch, and that makes him a target for me in these tournament games because I think he is one of the top right-handed pitchers coming up from the minor leagues, and we're going to see why a lot tonight. Why has Syndergaard been so successful? I'm sure you've heard a lot of the hype about how he's been one of the better pitchers in the minors, and he has a big arm, he has a good fastball, but we have to figure out why and why he would be successful in daily fantasy because you'll hear a lot of names being spit out about guys like Syndergaard, but you might not know why to start him. And here's why I'm starting him today in my tournament games. He works downhill. If you've seen Syndergaard pitch, he's a 6'5", 6'6" right-handed pitcher that just throws the ball straight down. Now, if you think about the way a batter has to hit, you've heard the old adage, it's a round ball and a round bat, and you got to hit it square. If a pitcher's throwing downhill, I'm not sure how you're supposed to square up a ball, especially if it's coming in at 96 miles an hour, which Syndergaard can reach at times throughout his start. He cruises at about 93, 94, which is still very hard, but he has what's called life on his fastball, and what that does is it creates movement, which indicates a fact that a opposing hitter not going to be able to get the barrel of the bat on the ball with the little bit of movement that he has at the end of his fastball. And that's just going to create more opportunities for outs and for strikeouts, which is something we're definitely targeting as we always talk about daily fantasy baseball. Now, when we look at low-priced pitchers, we're expecting them to get these strikeouts because otherwise we're not sure how they're going to be able to reach value and get you fantasy points. That's exactly why I like Noah Syndergaard today. This guy has struck out everybody throughout his whole career. He's at a strikeout per 9 of over 9 for his career, which means he's striking out more than a batter per inning, which on DraftKings, if you have one strikeout in a clean inning, it's giving you about 5 or 6 fantasy points, depending on how the rest of the inning goes. And that's huge for a guy that's going to go 5 or 6, because if he's getting a strikeout per inning, you're talking about 6 or 7 strikeouts throughout a start, and that's going to bring him right to value given his price today. Now on FanDuel, strikeouts are even more so important for me because they're only scoring in 3 ways on FanDuel. You get a point for an inning pitched, you get a point for a strikeout, and a negative point for a run allowed, in addition to the 4-point bonus with a win. A guy like Syndergaard who strikes out people at a 30% rate is big for me on FanDuel because if he's going to be able to get those strikeouts and a clean inning, you're talking about a very good return on your investment from a pitcher that doesn't cost very much. Now, we talked about, obviously, he has this great ability to strike out hitters, but why? Noah Syndergaard curveball, former Mets manager, or current Mets manager, Terry Collins, I'm going to quote him here, a hook from hell. Now, if that's not a benefit from a manager that he talks about, I don't know what is. You guys will see his curveball tonight. The guy that throws, I mentioned, 94, 95 miles an hour. Once you see his curveball, it reminds me of a pitcher that I'm sure Benny remembers, and Mark Pryor, one of the best curveballs he's ever seen before his injury. That's what Syndergaard's curveball looks like, and it's really impressive. It's dropping about 2 feet from the point of its breaking point, and that gives him a high ability to strike out a lot of hitters, which is one reason why I'm targeting him, especially in these tournament games. Now, if news comes out that he won't have an innings limit or a pitch limit tonight because he's pitched a lot in the minor leagues, I might move him into my 50-50 and head-to-head lineups, although it is his first start. That might be dangerous, but that's something I'm definitely targeting. I have very high hopes for this kid. Now, there's one guy we always talk about pitchers to stay away from, and we mentioned it last week, and that's Chris Sale. Chris Sale is a guy that Benny and I has always talked about. He's one of the better pitchers in baseball, probably one of the best left-handed pitchers in baseball. But he's not using his slider anymore, and that's a big part of his repertoire. The ability for him to throw his slider to lefties and righties has really given him the ability to limit runs and get a lot of strikeouts. Without that slider, he's given up a lot of hits, a lot of runs, and it's one reason why he's been a target so far this year rather than a guy to put into your lineups. Now, he faces the Brewers today, and I remember showing you guys last week on how I like to target hitters against pitchers against opposing hitters. You look at the batting average against the left or right side, slugging percentages, things of that nature. The Brewers have struggled a lot against left-handed pitchers, but that's because they haven't had their big bats in a lineup for the whole year. Guys like Ryan Braun have sat a little while, and Carlos Gomez was out for the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. They're both back, and they're both hitting well. We saw the Brewers hit the ball pretty well yesterday, and they have some guys that can hit the ball out of the ballpark. Even Elian Herrera hit a home run yesterday. So we're talking about some good righties in that lineup, like Braun, like Carlos Gomez. Chris Davis can hit lefties as well. So I'm staying away from Sale today because although he may be the most talented pitcher, if he's not using that slider, he's a guy I might be targeting, and I'm not putting him in any of my lineups. Are you the same way, Benny? You're not going with any Sale today?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, we talked about it before the show with, if you look at the pitches that he's throwing this year and the fact that he's not throwing that slider and how successful that slider was for him, he's basically going to a changeup that he's been throwing. hasn't been able to find the plate with it, hasn't gotten anywhere near the same swing and misses or strikeouts with it. So, I mean, I know this is the cheapest he's been in a while, but right now I just don't really trust him. But I do think that what you were talking about with Syndergaard was pretty interesting. So let me throw a quick question back at you with him. What kind of a line do you think we can expect from him tonight? Like, do you think he goes, I mean, I'm expecting him to go 5 or 6 innings. Would you agree with that? Probably not going to go further than that?
I think it really depends on that first time through the order, because a new pitcher coming up, he's going to have a lot of people will say guys like that aren't nervous, but he's going to be nervous. It's his first start. But if he can get clean through that first time through the order, which I think can happen because a lot of these guys haven't seen Syndergaard before, and he is a very talented pitcher. If he gets through that first line or that first time through the lineup, I think he can go 6 innings. He can get 5 or 6 strikeouts, give up a couple hits. With the fact that he does throw hard, though, all it takes is one barrel to hit that ball out of the ballpark. I can't expect 6 shutout innings. It's hard to expect that, especially from a guy in his first start. But I think he could get 6 innings with a few strikeouts, no doubt.
Yeah, like I'm thinking if he can get me 6 innings. You know, again, having seen him pitch and having know his background, you're probably expecting at least 6 strikeouts if he goes 6 innings. So right there on FanDuel, that's 12 points. If he can limit them to less than 2 runs, that's, you know, a plus 10. And then if he picks up the win, that's 14. That's 7,000. I mean, that's, you know, basically 2 points per 1,000 a cost. So that's pretty good. That would be pretty good value if he could return something like that for you. Over on DraftKings, it'd be a little bit tougher. I think he's like 72 over there, so you'd probably need about the same, probably about 18, 22 points out of him. I mean, basically, it's not out of the question. But I do think, and I wanted to get your take on this. He's probably limited for upside, right? Because I mean, I know he's a young guy and they're bringing him up, but they're probably not going to let him go 7, 8 innings tonight, right? So we're basically hoping that he has a high strikeout game if we want some upside out of him.
Yeah, it's hard to target guys, young guys like that, who you've seen the Mets have had their injury issues with their righties in the past, with Harvey's having that hurt surgery and Zach Wheeler being hurt. So even if he's cruising through 6 or 7, there's no reason at this point for Syndergaard to be stretched out an incredible amount. I'm looking for his limit will probably be close to around 90 or 100 pitches, and I think that's at best. You see guys that come up, have you seen top prospects, they only throw 5 or 6 innings, even with a low pitch count. And I think that's what we're looking for Syndergaard. So his upside, or I want to say his floor is limited, because if he's not throwing 6 or 7 innings and he doesn't get as high amount of strikeouts early, you're not going to be able to see him get much past 12 or 13 fantasy points on DraftKings or 6 or 7 on FanDuel. But I think his upside is okay simply because of the ability he can strike out Cubs hitters. And the Cubs, we always mention, are number 1 in striking out against right-handed bats. So even if he goes 6 innings, he has the potential, and I want to use that word a lot here because it's his first start, to strike out more than 6 batters in an inning. And that's a very good return with his price on both sites.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking as well. All right, good. Well, hey, there you go, guys. There's some some pitching knowledge for you, a couple guys that you can think about. You know, like we said, we don't really like some of the top guys up there. Real quick, Josh, do you have any thoughts on, I know Sale, neither one of us like. Do you have any quick thoughts on Strasburg before we move on to hitters?
Strasburg's been a guy that we talked about, and we used the word batting average per balls in play a lot with him. Is every now and then it just seems like he's given up too many hits and too many runs, and a lot of people talked about his last start. Is he, quote-unquote, done? Now, he still has great stuff. He's still one of the better pitchers in terms of talent in baseball, but his results have not been great lately, and he's just not a guy that I can target with some of the lower-priced guys that I like today. If you're going to pay up for pitching, you can't argue with him with his strikeout upside, but he's not a guy that's on my radar today, no.
All right, fair enough. I went a little bit deeper into some of the questions on pitching today, because I think that pitching is going to be real important to your overall score today. It's not an easy day for pitching. There's a lot of different ways you can go. There's a lot of those guys. Josh and I were talking before the show. There's a lot of guys that fall in that mid-tier category that we talked about last week that aren't really guys you want to target to take, but they're also not guys that you really want to target against. And it's tough when you have a lot of those guys because you do need to start some, at least 1 on FanDuel and at least 2 on, sites like DraftKings and Aces. So pitching is going to be important today. I wanted to make sure we gave you guys some thoughts on it. And, as always, look at those lineups when they come out. If anybody's sitting a whole bunch of their bats, if anybody's lineup looks real weak, it could tick some of these guys that we mentioned up. But now I wanted to move on and get into the last part of the show. I'm going to talk about some hitters. There's a lot of guys that I like today. and there's a lot of guys that I like that are going to cost a couple bucks. So I am glad that there are some cheap pitching options that we can use, because there are some big bats that I want to have in my lineup. Starting at catcher, there are two guys that I'm looking at today. The first is Stephen Vogt, and the other one is Derek Norris. So these are two guys who know each other well. They were teammates last year. Vogt's going up against the Boston Red Sox. He gets a matchup with Justin Masterson today. Last year, Masterson allowed left-handed batters to hit 320 off of him, and this year he's already allowed them to hit 280. So it's a trend that we want to try to exploit out there. Vogt right now is batting .337 with 8 home runs, on base plus slugging of 1.070. So this guy has basically been killing the ball, and Vogt hits better against right-handed pitching. So his batting average, his home runs, and his on-base plus slugging are all higher against right-handed pitching. So this is the perfect matchup that he'd be looking for. The one drawback with Vogt is he has dropped down in the order a little bit. He was hitting in that 3-hole, which is, basically when he was hitting there as a catcher, hitting in the 3-hole, there's very few that you're going to find there. So he was a guy that we were recommending and using almost every day. But even in the 5-hole, he's still going to have a lot of RBI opportunities. He's still going to be in a good spot to get a couple hits. The game is at home in Oakland, so it's not exactly a hitter's ballpark. But again, he's been playing all his home games there already, and he's hitting .337, so it's not something that's really going to scare me off him. His price is somewhat reasonable. DraftKings, he's $3,900, so he's not too expensive, but he's not cheap either. I think he's about the 6th or 7th highest catcher. Over on FanDuel, he is closer to the top. He's $3,700 on FanDuel, which makes him, I think, either the 3rd or 4th most expensive catcher over there. So he's not cheap. He's definitely not going to be one of the cost-saving guys. But again, he's got as much upside as anybody else out there. He's somebody who's in a good, a good spot. He's flashed some power. He's got some upside that he could hit a home run. So Stephen Vogt is definitely one of the guys I'm going to be looking at today. If you want to go a little cheaper though and save a little bit of money, Derek Norris is another great option today. James Paxton is pitching for Seattle. That game's in Seattle, so again, not a great hitter's ballpark. Paxton's a lefty, and Norris has been a proven smasher of left-handed pitching. Last year, he hit .311 against lefties, and so far this year, he's 13 of 25. So he's basically hitting over 500 so far in 2015 against left-handed pitching. Again, Paxton's a guy who's tougher on lefties. He gives it up a little bit to righties. He's actually been okay. It's not like he's got a 400 batting average against right-handed batters. But against lefties, he's been incredibly tough over the course of his career, which, again, is a small sample size because he really just came up and started pitching last year and then is pitching again this year. So it's not a ton to go on, but, basically you got to look at what you have right now. And from what I see, he's a little bit weaker against right-handed batters, and a guy like Norris is a proven smasher of left-handed pitching. So if you're looking to save a little bit at catcher, Derek Norris is the guy I'd go to. If you can afford to pay up, I think you get more upside with Vogt, though. But those are the two guys who I'm going to be rolling out in most of my games today. Moving on to first base. I actually like 2 first basemen, and they both happen to be playing in the same game. Now, first base, as we've said before, is not a position where I ever punt. It's somewhere where I pay up because there's always going to be a first baseman. There's 7 or 8 good options every day. So by definition, you're going to have it spread out a little bit more, so you never really take a guy and expect him to be 40 or 50% owned as a first baseman. So you can pretty much go with whatever guy you think is your favorite. And the 2 guys who are my favorite today are Freddie Freeman and Joey Votto. Freeman is going up against the Cincinnati Reds as a matchup with Anthony DeSclafani, the right-handed pitcher. Freeman hit over 300 and 400 at-bats against righties in 2014. So far this year, he's hitting .322 with 4 home runs and only 89 at-bats against right-handed pitcher. DeSclafani is much tougher on righties than he is on lefties. He basically is almost unhittable so far this year for right-handed batters, but left-handed batters have been knocking him around a little bit. Since 2014, he's allowed them to hit .287 with 6 home runs and 19 earned runs, and basically in limited innings. So it's a great matchup for Freeman. They're playing that game in Cincinnati, so it's a good hitter's ballpark. There's definitely a chance that he can, get under one of these. And again, we mentioned earlier today the wind's blowing out about 15 miles an hour there. So I do like a lot of the home run hitters in this game, the guys who I think are in good matchups. We're going to get a little bump from me with the wind blowing out in a home run hitter's ballpark like the Great American Ballpark. And again, that's also why I like the first baseman on the other side of this game in Joey Votto. Votto gets to match up with the young Mike Foltynewicz, who has basically struggled against left-handed batters so far in his career. 14 innings against lefties in his major league career. spanning the last 3 seasons, he's allowed 23 hits, 11 runs, and 4 home runs. So he's basically giving up about a home run every 3.5 innings. He's giving up almost 2 hits an inning at this point, and a little bit less than a run an inning against left-handed batters. So if there's any left-handed batters that you like on Cincinnati today, they all should be in good spots. The guy that I like the most, as I just said, is Joey Votto. Listen to Votto's stats so far this year. He has 78 at-bats against right-handed pitching. He's 25 hits. 7 of them have been for home runs, 4 doubles, and 13 walks. So basically, this guy is an on-base machine against right-handed pitching. He's basically up there at about a .450 on-base percentage against right-handers so far this year. And again, his on-base plus slugging is insane. He has a home run every 11 at-bats against right-handed pitching in 2015. And again, the wind's blowing out. He's playing in a hitter's park against a young rookie who has been, shown already that he struggles with left-handed bats. So there's a lot going in Votto's favor today. So he's a little bit cheaper on DraftKings than Freeman is. Freeman is 51 on DraftKings. Votto is 45. But if you go over on FanDuel, I think Votto's a little bit more expensive. He's 38. No, actually, he's still cheaper over there, too. He's 38, and Freeman is 39. So Votto's a guy you could save a little bit of money with. Freeman, though, probably has the better matchup against DeScalfani. DeScalfani is more of a home run pitcher. He's a guy who's giving it up a little more. But I think both of those guys are going to be in play for you. Moving on to second base. There's actually 3 guys I like at second base. I'm going to give you 2 expensive options and then a cheap guy that you could throw in there if you need to save some money because, like I said, there are some big bats that we want to try to fit in today. The first guy is going to be Neil Walker. Neil Walker is going up against the Philadelphia Phillies. He gets a matchup with Sean O'Sullivan. Left-handed bats against O'Sullivan. In 17 innings pitched at the major league level, he's allowed 28 hits, 11 runs, and 4 home runs to left-handed bats. So he's basically given up a home run about every 4 innings, given up about a hit and a half per inning, and given up about 2 runs every 3 innings against left-handed bats. So Neil Walker is definitely somebody who I think is in play. He's a switch hitter, should be hitting in the middle of that Pittsburgh order. They have been putting him up in the 2 hole in front of McCutcheon right now, which is only actually helping him see some more pitches. In his last couple games, he's had 21, 12, 14, and 9 in his last 4 games for the Pirates since he's been hitting up in that 2 hole in front of McCutcheon. And it's no secret that, basically that's coincided with the Pirates offense starting to wake up a little bit. Guys like McCutcheon are starting to hit again. Guys like Marte are starting to hit. Polanco and Walker have both been getting on base. So if those guys can set the table for the big bats behind them, that offense should be clicking like people thought they were going to be earlier in the year. So Neil Walker is definitely a guy who I think is in play. 4,400 on DraftKings is a little pricey, but he's only $3,000 on FanDuel. So if you're looking for a second baseman on FanDuel, I definitely think that Neil Walker is one of those guys you should consider. Now, on both sites, one of the most expensive second base options, but somebody who I would pay up for if you have the money to do so, is going to be Dee Gordon. Dee Gordon gets the rookie Bolsinger from the Dodgers. He struggles a little bit with left-handed bats. Again, limited sample size. The guy hasn't pitched that many innings in major leagues, so you got to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But he's definitely tougher on righties than he is on lefties. So there's a good chance Dee Gordon could wind up with a hit or 2 today. And the thing that I really like about Dee Gordon, as we always talk about, is I like Dee Gordon when he's in a matchup where I think he can get on base a couple times. Because if he gets on base a couple times, he's going to try to steal. And if he's going up against Yasmani Grandal, there's a very good chance that he's going to be safe when he does steal. Last year, Grandal had an 85% safe rate on people trying to steal bases off him. And this year, that rate is actually a little bit better for him, but it's still a 75% success rate for base stealers against him. Basically, he's throwing out less than 1 out of every 5 guys who tries to run on him. So if you get a guy like Dee Gordon, who has been thrown out a few times, but also has a lot of speed and tries to steal bases all the time, if you get him on base 2 or 3 times, I can guarantee you he's going to run at least once. And against a guy like Bolsinger, who struggles with left-handed batters, I think there's a good chance for him to get on base. Now, again, this is more of a DK play than it is a FanDuel play because speed plays more on DraftKings. But remember, if you can hit a single, steal second base, and then have one of those big bats behind you knock you in, that gets you 10 DraftKings points for 1 at-bat. And if you're paying $5,000 for a guy in a cash game and he does that once, he's going to get you value. Anything else he does after that at-bat, if he walks, if he gets another hit, if he has any RBIs, or if he does anything else in the rest of his at-bats that game, it's all just going to be gravy for you in your cash game. So while $5,000 might be a lot of money to spend on a second baseman today, if you have it to spend up on Dee Gordon, I think you're going to get more than 2.5 points per $1,000 of cost out of him, and that's going to be a great value return for you in your cash game. So Dee Gordon is the other guy besides Neil Walker who are my stud picks at second today. This last play is definitely another one that's DK specific, and that's Devon Travis. He's 3,300 on DraftKings and 3,600 on FanDuel. So on FanDuel, he's like the 4th or 5th highest second baseman, and you just can't pay up that much for this guy. I mean, he does have some upside. The matchup for him today is good, but not great. But 3,600 for a second baseman like Travis, I think makes no sense on FanDuel, so I wouldn't play him over there. But if you're looking for somebody to save salary with that has some upside and some safety for you on DraftKings, I mean, Travis at 3,300 is basically a steal. Until they raise this guy's price, he's going to be somebody who we mention almost every day because he's almost always in play. He's going up against, who do they have today? He's going up against Chris Tillman. Tillman's a guy who has given up a couple home runs so far this year. Even though Travis is a leadoff batter, he already has 7 home runs this year. So this is a guy with power. He's a guy who can get some hits, get on base, has a little bit of speed. So there's a lot of ways that a guy like Travis can score points for you today in daily fantasy. Again, like we said, Tillman has given up 5 home runs so far in 32 innings of work. You know, he's somebody who, who can get lit up. So even if Travis does get on, some of those big bats that are behind him might wind up going yard and driving him in as well. So he can get some hits, he can score some runs. He should be a guy that pays off that $3,300 salary. And I'd much rather take him knowing that he's going to be leading off than going down and grabbing somebody else in that price range who might be batting like 7th or 8th in the order. Might even be a National League guy batting in front of a pitcher. So as far as the slim pickings go at second base, if you're looking for a cheap guy, I don't think you have to go any further than taking Devon Travis, who's going to be on top of that lineup for him. Moving on to third base now. Third base is a position I'm going to try to save at because basically I've given you guys a couple high-priced options, and there's going to be a couple more coming in the outfield. But the 2 guys who I'm using over there are Mike Moustakas and Luis Valbuena. Both guys are in good splits matchup. So far, Moustakas has a .323 batting average against right-handed pitching. So against a guy like Martinez, I definitely think he's in play. Texas is a hitter's ballpark. You know, Martinez has been tougher on righties. He's allowed lefties to hit about .279 against them with a whip of .169 and a home run every 7 innings last year. So he has struggled against lefties in his past. Moustakas is hitting on the top of that lineup. He's in the 2-hole, and I do expect them to score some runs today. I don't expect this run of Rangers pitching or of Nick Martinez to continue. Eventually, things are going to regress to the mean, and I think that today might be the first day in that regression because this Rangers pitching staff can't keep doing what it's doing for long. Valbuena is going up against San Francisco. He gets a matchup today with Chris Heston. Chris Heston has been very, very good this year. And the one thing where Heston has struggled with is left-handed bats. And that's why I think he might be a sneaky play today against Houston because Houston really doesn't have any left-handed bats outside of Valbuena. He is their best left-handed bat, which is not saying a ton. But when they go up against right-handed pitching, he finds himself in the 2-hole, in the 3-hole, worst-case scenario in the 5-hole as one of the power guys. And, you know, so far this year, he's been pretty good. In 82 at-bats against right-handed pitching, he already has 6 home runs. His batting average is only around .250, so he's not a high-average guy. But if you're looking for an upside play for a GPP, he's definitely a guy that has some pop. He's a little bit expensive on DraftKings at $3,900. Moustakas is only $42, so I would try to get the other $300 and spend up for, Moustakas if you can. But those are 2 guys who I think are in play at third base. Shortstop, I'm going to make this real easy for you guys. You're playing Troy Tulowitzki today. Troy Tulowitzki is going up against a left-handed pitcher. In his last 97 at-bats over the last couple years against left-handed pitching, he has 41 hits, 9 of them for doubles, 10 of them for home runs. So not only does this guy hit left-handed pitching, not only does this guy hit left-handed pitching, but he hits it hard, he hits it for average, and he hits it for power, and he scores a lot of runs with it. So Tulo against left-handed pitching is almost an automatic start for me. Goes up against C.J. Wilson, who's a guy who struggled a little bit more with right-handed batters. About a .270 average with 15 home runs in 2014, .264 with 13 home runs in 2013. So the way to get at Wilson is with the right-handed batters, and the way, to be in Tulo's wheelhouse is to be a left-handed pitcher. So all the stars line here today. I think Tulo. And the other thing is on DraftKings, his price is only $4,400 today. If you're telling me I can get Troy Tulowitzki for $4,400 or go and spend $4,000 on some of these other shortstops that have no upside, this is a no-brainer for me. I mean, I'm taking Tulo, I'm not looking back, and I'm not even going to think twice about it today. If you do need another shortstop, if you wanted to go a little cheaper, I think Xander Bogaerts is in a pretty good matchup. He hits in the bottom of that Boston order, but this guy absolutely smashes left-handed pitching. He doesn't have a lot of power, but he's a guy who racks up a lot of hits when he plays against lefties. So if you're looking to save, you can go with Bogaerts, but if you're not starting Tulo today in any of your cash games, in my opinion, on DraftKings, you're doing it wrong because $4,400 is just way too cheap for him. Moving on to the outfield, there are 4 outfielders I'm going to mention to you guys, and I don't even want anybody else in my lineup. The first guy is Adam Jones. Jones is going up against Mark Burley. Jones smashes against left-handed pitching. They're playing in Baltimore. He's got a very good matchup today. He's a very good hitter. And here's another one whose price is really deflated. Baltimore's a good hitter's park. Jones is one of their best hitters batting in the 3-hole, and he's only $4,300 today on DraftKings. So if you're playing over on DraftKings, Adam Jones is one of those guys that's just way too cheap for you not to include in your lineup today. And speaking of guys who are way too cheap not to include in your lineup today, another one plays for the Oakland Athletics, and that's Josh Reddick. Now, this guy has been absolutely on fire lately, and he's only $3,700 against the Red Sox. Again, great matchup for him. Masterson's a guy who struggles against left-handed bats. Reddick's the guy who's hitting in the 3-hole now because he's been so hot, because he's been so good. Had another 2-for-3 game yesterday, had a walk as well included on that. I mean, this guy's just putting up good numbers, solid numbers day after day. He's batting .316 so far this year, 5 home runs, and OPS just under 1,000. Double-digit fantasy points in 6 of his last 11 games. And at $3,700, that's just the steal. So if you're looking for some cheap outfielders, you don't even have to take any scrubs today or make any flyers. $3,700 for Reddick, $4,300 for Adam Jones. I mean, those two guys put together will fit nicely into most lineups that you're going to make today, especially with no really, really high-cost pitching. So that brings us down to the last 2 guys I want to talk about. Both of these guys are expensive. Both of these guys are studs. And both of these guys I think you should be trying to fit into your lineup one way or another today, no matter what site you're playing on. All right, the first one I'm going to talk about is Bryce Harper against Arizona. He gets a matchup with Ruby De La Rosa. Now, De La Rosa struggles with left-handed bats. In 2015 already, they're hitting .282 against him with 4 home runs. Last year, he allowed left-handed bats to hit .320 off of him in a much larger sample size. So left-handed bats is definitely the way we want to try to exploit Ruby De La Rosa. Here are Harper's fantasy scores over his last 5 games. You ready for this? 46, 37, 23, 12, and 9 on DraftKings. Those aren't fantasy scores. Those sound like winning lottery numbers. I mean, 46, 37, 23, that's insane. You know, for a guy to do that 3 games in a row, he scored 107 DraftKings points in a 3-game stretch. That's almost unheard of. All right, so this guy's about as hot as he could be right now. He's hitting home runs left and right. He loves hitting against right-handed pitching. He's a proven masher of right-handed pitching. And on top of it, he gets a positive park bump because they're switching from Washington over to Arizona, which is a hitter-friendly ballpark. So you're going to have to pay up for Bryce Harper today. He's $5,300, but the matchup is too good, the ballpark is too good, and the way he's been swinging the bat has been too good. So he's definitely a guy you got to try to fit into your lineups today. And then the last guy that I'm going to be trying to fit into my lineups is another guy in that same, basically that same ilk, and that's Mike Trout. Trout goes up against Kyle Kendricks. Now, I don't really need to get into how bad Kyle Kendricks been. Yes, he's been worse to left-handed batters, but this guy's given up a .300 batting average and given up home runs to everybody on any side of the plate. So the fact that Trout is a right-hander doesn't really scare me away from him. In fact, as a right-handed batter against right-handed pitching, Trout has been hitting over 300 over the course of the last season and a half. Excuse me. So, it basically doesn't matter to me that it's not a righty-lefty split here. Trout's a guy that can hit any kind of pitching, and Kendrick's a guy that can give up hits to anybody. So Trout is another guy that I think you have to use today. He's been averaging over 14.8 points per game over his last 5 games. So he's another one that's expensive at $5,300. But again, if he's getting you almost 3 points per $1,000 of cost, expensive and value are relative terms. He might be expensive on a relative basis of it costing you a lot of money, but if he's going to be returning 15 points for you, 15 DraftKings points at that price, he's still a good value. So it's not like you're getting ripped off and spending up too much for him. He's priced about where he should be priced. So again, with guys like Reddick and guys like Jones, you can fit one of these studs in. If you use a couple cheaper options, especially at pitcher, you might even be able to fit in both Harper Harper and Trout today and still have, some room left over to grab one of those other two outfielders we mentioned. So those are the guys that I wanted to talk about today. We basically have gone through all the hitters. Right now, Josh and I are kind of going to give you a little bit of an idea of how we're going to be building our lineups today. So, Josh, do you want to get into the people with some of the things that you like today and how you're going to be building, who your cornerstones are?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a lot of Noah Syndergaard in my tournament lineup. If you guys haven't figured that out, by the way, I talked him up earlier. I'm definitely gonna have him in some of these cheap tourneys because he gives a little bit of a price relief. But as for my 50-50s and head-to-heads, I'm gonna have a lot of AJ Burnett and Edinson Volquez. I think those two are the safest pitchers on the day. While you're not limiting your ability to put in some top hitters, they aren't so cheap that you're limiting your upside in terms of pitching fantasy points, which I still think is the key in your 50-50s and head-to-heads. In terms of hitters, I'm going to need some cheap guys, so I'll be waiting to see later when lineups come out. But I'm going to be targeting guys like Billy Burns, Coco Crisp for the A's. Those two go against Justin Matheson, who struggles to give up a lot of base runners. And with those guys hitting in front of guys like Reddick and Billy Butler, they have a chance to score a lot of runs and potentially steal some bases. Some other guys I'm going to target for hitters are I like the lefties from the Angels against Kyle Kendrick, and I do like a lot of the Brewers righties if you can find them at a cheap price. I'm going to try to get in some Carlos Gomez today against Sale, especially in tournaments because I think he will be very low owned, but he has potential to pretty much hit the ball anywhere in the field, and with his speed, he can get a triple, he can get a stolen base. Although Sale is a left-handed pitcher, he has a weird windup, so it's easy for a guy like Gomez to steal base if he gets on base. But that pretty much rounds out how my lineup's going to go today. Benny, how are you going to do it today?
Excuse me. Well, I kind of agree with a lot of what you said. Burnett's a guy that I find myself taking in a lot of places. I'm using Simon a little bit more than Volquez, but I have both, some of both of those two guys. I hadn't had a lot of Syndergaard in my lineups which is actually why I was asking you some of those questions about him. So I might have to work a little bit more of him in there as well. But again, like I said, I don't think this is a day where you have to pay up for pitching. I think a Sale and Strasburg combination is pretty dumb, and you're not going to find it on any of my lineups. So I'm going to be paying up for a lot of bats. Again, I just told you guys there's 4 guys in the outfield who I love. Bryce Harper, Trout, Reddick, Jones. I'm going to be trying to get as much of those 4 guys into my lineups as possible. I'm literally starting my lineups on DraftKings by putting the $4,400 Troy Tulowitzki in there in the lefty-righty matchup. That is literally the first person I'm starting with and building around. I find myself with a lot more Votto than Freeman on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I got a little bit of both of them because they're about the same price. I used a lot of Norris because I needed that price savings, but I do like Vogt as well. If you can afford him, I think he's a guy you can spend up on. And that's pretty much it. I mean, that's how I'm building my rosters, and then I'm basically going to pitching last. Normally I start with pitching and go to bats, but because I don't really have any strong feelings about any of the pitchers today, I think it might be a day where I probably try to play a few more tournaments and a little bit less in cash games, just because I don't have a lot of certainty on pitching. And whenever that happens, that kind of tends to be the way I set my plays up for the night. So it's just a little teaching point for you guys to think about. When you don't have a lot of certainty, you don't want to be playing a lot of cash games. So if you think there's a lot of volatility basically equals tournaments. So I might do, maybe 3 or 4 lineups and throw them in the Moonshot and a couple other tournaments tonight, and then maybe go half as heavy as I usually do in my cash games. Because, I mean, everybody who we talked about, guys like Volquez, guys like AJ Burnett, guys like Simon, they're all in good spots tonight, but they all have a little bit of blow-up ability. So I'm not like super confident in any of them. So whenever that happens, it usually winds up being more of a tournament night for me, and I think that's probably going to be the way I play it today. So that's about it, though. Hopefully it works out, and I'll get at least one of those tournament rosters up there towards the top.
That's a good point, and like you said, if you don't like the slate, don't play as much as you normally would. There's no shame in not playing as much, because if you don't win, you don't lose as much. Money loss is a lot worse than not playing enough and winning a little bit. So be sure to keep an eye on the confidence levels of the pitching and the hitters. If you don't like it, don't play. It's not too bad to do that. You don't be ashamed if you missed out a little bit. But we do have some decent pitching options, and with Tulo in that lineup, I think we have a chance to get some high scores tonight. So that brings us to the top of the hour, though, and we will be back tomorrow, Wednesday, May 13th at noon. For Benny Ricciardi, I'm Josh Kalachi. This has been The Curve. Be sure to check out a lot of the new tools on rotocurve.com. Look up in the forums. We'll be there pretty much all day. I know myself and Benny will be there for a little while as new lineups are coming out. So be sure to check us out there and find us on Twitter at Benny R11 and at Josh Kalachi, and be sure to follow the RotoCurve account as well. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the show. Benny, you have one more thing left?
That's right. Stay classy, DFS. Good luck tonight. Love you guys.